One of the things that dramatically changed history across the world was the Columbian Exchange. And essentially, what it was just that, an exchange of goods or a trade of goods between Europe and the Americas. And eventually, it went down to Africa, which you'll see in a minute. But mainly, it was this exchange of goods and trade between Europe and the Americas. So, some of the things that were traded were potatoes in Europe, and that greatly increased the population. And I know what you're thinking. How can potatoes increase the population? They're not even that good. First of all, they are that good. And second of all, when you have more food, then you can feed more people. So when potatoes just exploded because they're easy to grow and you can grow them in almost any climate, then the production of them went up, which meant you could have a larger family and feed more people, and that increased the population. Oranges. Oranges thrived in Florida, and they're still there today, which is why it's the nation's capital for orange production. Now, sugar and cotton were huge crops that just expanded like crazy. But with sugar and cotton, they both needed a lot of farmland. And because of that, it increased the need for manual labor. And because people were, unfortunately, the way they were back then, they didn't want to pay people, so they used slave labor for the sugar and cotton fields. Now, sugar and cotton, as you see, are numbered one and two. Sugar was the number one crop that just exploded and had a need for manual labor, which is unfortunately why the need for slave labor increased. And then cotton was number two. A couple other diseases, though, that came over and had a negative impact was smallpox, syphilis, malaria, and yellow fever. So, as I mentioned a second ago with sugar and cotton, the need for manual labor in the way of slaves, that originated with the native people in a land. It was in the Caribbeans, in some of the Central America areas. But what happened is the Europeans would enslave the Native Americans there and then use them for slave labor. But then when the Europeans brought the diseases over, it wiped out the vast majority of the native population. So the Europeans looked around and said they don't want to pay anybody again. So they looked for other sources of slave labor. And that source, unfortunately, again, came from Africa. So the Middle Passage was the name of the journey from Africa to the Americas for those slave passages. The definition is the name of the journey of the African slaves to America, as I said. So what happened was you had this explosion of the sugar crop. The people wanted manual labor in the way of slaves, so they had the Native Americans use, or the native people of those lands, as the manual laborers, as slaves. But when those diseases came over, the native population was wiped out, which increased the need for other people for manual labor because they didn't want to pay, again, unfortunately. This led to what was called a plantation economy in North America, South America, and the Caribbean, and they used slavery for that manual labor, which had the highest cost for crop production on plantations in America. And that's how slave labor went from being in the native people all the way over to African people coming over to Americas. So with all that moving around came a couple new social classes. So if you can imagine this in a social pyramid, you had the peninsulares on the top. And who the peninsulares were the people who were born in Spain or Portugal and came over to the New World. Then that second tier on the pyramid were the Creoles. These were European people, descendants of the Europeans, who were born in America. On that third tier of that pyramid, you had the mestizos, those of native and European mixed descent. So a European and a native person would have a child, and they would be a mestizo, and they were third on that rung in that social ladder. And then last on that social pyramid would be the Native Americans and the African slaves.